Okay, you're
on my page here. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Budget Line of Business, fourth annual Intro to Budget Forum. This session is Intro to Apportionment. I'm your host, Janice Butler. I'm a senior advisor with Budget Line of Business Program Management Office. And a little bit about our office. We work with 25 partner agency budget offices. They pay for a membership for you to take advantage of trainings as you are in today. Also, they work with us to develop modern and adaptable technology systems for you. We have two presenters today, Andy Pavord and Courtney Timberlake. Andy is the founder of the Federal Consultant Alliance, has led budget processes for the DC government, the U.S. Small Business Administration, and the U.S. Department of Treasury. He managed headquarters operation for the U.S. Department of Treasury and served as chief of state to the chief financial officers of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. He also serves as a training coordinator for Budget Line of Business. He retired as a colonel in the Army Reserve after 32 years that include deployment to Desert Storm. He earned a MA in economics from George Mason University. We also have Courtney Timberlake, serves as a senior vice president and director, federal financial advisor service at the Craddock Group LLC. Previously, she served as the deputy chief financial officer for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, leading teams focused on budget financial management. She also served at the Office of Management and Budget for more than 20 years in various roles. All right, Andy, and turn it over to you.
okay. So this class is a little bit of repetition from the previous class because the previous class we had to cover apportionments as part of execution, and we do want these classes to be standalone, so we talked about apportionments. But this next hour or so, and I'm going to talk about apportionments in a little more detail to help hopefully give you a better insight into apportionments. And we're going to do a little bit of a change here. We're not going to have a break, and so that way we can end about 10 to 15 minutes early. So I hope you're okay with that. So what we're going to talk about, what is an apportionment? And the little tiny bit of history just to set the context of why this process was created. And then we'll go through the process of apportionment. We'll talk about how an apportionment is organized. And then we'll talk about apportionments and budget execution, and then close with discussion of CRs and apportionments. Okay, next slide.
Andy, you want to share your screen?
Oh, I thought it was.
No.
Oops, sorry about that. So what is an apportionment? Okay, everybody see that? So apportionment is part of a larger life cycle of of the budget process. You know, you have the max, where you enter data in for the president's budget request, and then there's the apportionment that's part of that. So it starts in formulation, right, where you enter data into max, and we've talked about that earlier today, that creates the president's budget appendix. Then the data, Congress uses this information to enact laws, and we talked about that in the reading laws and a little bit in the budget execution classes, and now into execution. So you have the max president's budget, the appropriation law, and then there's the SF 132 apportionment, and then that follows the SF 133, which does essentially the prior year numbers in the president's budget appendix. So I just wanted you to see that this is part of a context. The apportionment's part of a larger life cycle, you could call it, budget and reporting. So apportionment guidance is always on RMB Circular A11. The key section is section 120 that talks about the apportionment process. Then section 123, which talks about apportionments under continuing resolution, and Appendix F, which talks about the format of the apportionment and shows how it relates to the SF-133 and the Schedule P, which is in the President's Budget Appendix. Okay, so let's just start with the basics. What is an apportionment? So I'm, going right out of A11, Section 120.1. An apportionment is an OMB approved plan to use budgetary resources. It typically limits the obligations you may incur for specified time periods, for programs, activities, projects, objects, or combination thereof. An apportionment is legally binding, which means you cannot obligate more money than is approved in the apportionment, and obligations and expenditures that can exceed an apportionment are a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. And you must report, as I think we've covered earlier, you must report a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act to OMB and ultimately to the president. Remember, the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits you and any other federal employee from entering into contracts that exceed enacted appropriations for the year and purchasing services and merchandise before appropriations are enacted. So let's just talk about apportionments and the Anti-Deficiency Act. And again, I'm following right out of A11. So if you want to reinforce this, you can go to A11 and read it for yourself, but we'll talk it through today. So the Act requires that an OMB apportion the appropriations. That is, approve a plan that spreads out spending over the fiscal year for which the funds were made available. So you have to submit to OMB your plan for the annual year, spreading out the funding so you don't run out of funds too early, and we'll talk about that in the history section, before you can obligate funds. And it requires, again, subject to the approval of OMB, that the head of each executive agency prescribe by regulation a system of administrative control of funds. So the Anti-Deficiency Act is actually more than just you can't spend more than is appropriated and more than is apportioned. It's like it states that it is the responsibility of the head of the agency. So that's if you're in a department, that's the secretary. If you're at the Small Business Administration, that would be the administrator, is responsible for setting up a system that makes sure that you proactively do not exceed the apportionment amount and, of course, the appropriation amount. So restricts deficiency apportionments to amounts approved by the agency heads only for extraordinary, emergency, or unusual circumstances. So what's a deficiency apportionment? That's an apportionment where you have to go in and say, we don't have enough money because something extraordinary happened, and 9/11 is kind of a situation like that, where, we thought we would have an even spend, but now we have to spend it all now because of this emergency. And so therefore you're saying we have a deficiency of funds, and therefore we need a new apportionment. That is extremely rare and should not happen under normal conditions. The Anti-Deficiency Act does establish penalties for Anti-Deficiency Act violations, where there's excessive spending. And it requires agency fund control regulations to specify that violations of allotments and sub-allotments are also a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So when you set up your funds control at the account level, you're supposed to allot and sub-allot and divide the spending down, spending limits down, the fund control limit down at lower levels, because that prevents roll-ups that would cause a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The Act requires the agency head to report any Anti-Deficiency Act violations to the president through the OMB director, the Congress, and the Comptroller General. So apportionment and TAFs. Now, you may remember from our earlier class sessions today that the Treasury account fund symbol is basically the building block of both accounting for the budget and for actual spending. And of course, there's OMB accounts are aligned with Treasury account fund symbols. All TAFs are required to be apportioned except for specific cases described in Section 120 of A11. What does that mean? That means the government can't spend money unless it goes through this apportionment process. That's what the Anti-Deficiency Act requires, and that's what OMBA 11 circular prescribes. And of course, we've talked about the FAST book that basically lists all the Treasury account fund symbols and specifies agency head, department, and things like that. Now, here's just an example of the code. 036 is the Treasury code. 20 is the period availability. So this is an old slide. And 012 is the account symbol and 012 will be the account symbol to both for Treasury and for the OMB in the President's Budget Appendix. So there are different types of apportionments. Account-specific apportionments are approved by an OMB Deputy Associate Director or designee, or an OMB official that has been delegated apportionment authority, and it usually is for a specific amount. And this is kind of the normal business as usual. When you get an appropriation law, you submit an apportionment for each of your accounts, and the accounts say how much money can be obligated, and therefore. But there is another type of apportionment. It's something called an automatic apportionment that is approved by the OMB director in the form of a bulletin or provision in A11. And that describes a formula that agencies will use to calculate the apportioned amount. Can anybody tell me when this is used the most? Something that's going to happen in a week, we hope. Continuing resolution. This is how apportionments are done for continuing resolution. And you can think about why this is so. Because a lot of times the veterans around who've been around know that sometimes you'll get an CR for a week or 2 days or a month. And if OMB had to go through the normal account-specific apportionment process, then it'd be overwhelmed. It would essentially stop spending because it takes more than a day or two to process a bunch of apportionments. So that's why they created this automatic process where essentially what happens is OMB sends a bulletin out, says, hey, we have a 15-day CR. This is the percentage of increase, percentage of your previous year that you're allowed to spend. Okay, so the question is, can you obligate funds once an apportionment has been submitted to OMB? Just in the chat. The answer is no, because it has to be an approved apportionment. And you can't say, oh, Congress passed the law, yeah, we're good to go, and OMB is going to accept the apportionment. No, you have to get that signature before you actually can obligate funds. So let's talk about why does the system exist? I mean, why did they create it? And there's reasons that are rooted in our history. And it's rooted ultimately in the Constitution. And we've showed you this before today, but this should be like on your, for a budgeteer, this is like the key phrase. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law and a regular statement of an account of receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. This is why we have this complex system set up. This is why government accounting is different than private sector accounting. Because private sector accounting, who cares where the money's come from, right? It's my money. I run a business. Like I own a business. The money is mine. I can do what I want with it. And where it comes from doesn't matter. That is not the way it works in government. Because in government, because of this clause of the Constitution, every penny has to be traced back to a law. Every penny spent has to be traced back to the appropriate law, because all this is set up to control government to make sure it doesn't violate Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. Now, that Constitution was enacted in 1787 and, confirmed in 1789, and our government started. So right from the beginning, there was controversy between the president and the legislative branch, the Congress, um, because they were fighting over how much control the legislature, the Congress, could exert over the presidency. And there were complaints from the very, very beginning with Alexander Hamilton when he was Secretary of the Treasury. Members of Congress, Gallatin, complained that he was spending money improperly, that he was spending money in ways that were not consistent with the appropriation law. So what Congress did is they passed ever more detailed appropriation laws. And these at this period of our time, they were very, very specific. We're going to build a bridge over this river for this amount of money, and we're going to employ these 6 people in the War Office, and they're going to make it, and it would say in the law how much money they made. So it was incredibly detailed appropriations. And so they fought about it. So John Adams, Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, he decided he didn't want to play this game. And so he just started moving money around and spending it the way he wanted. He did not expend more money than was appropriated, but he didn't worry too much about the purpose. So in 1809, Congress got tired of this. They passed a law banning appropriation transfers. But that didn't work because what happened was members of the executive branch developed ways to get around that. Now, at this point in time, there's no budget. There's just appropriation laws. And there's also the president doesn't compile all the appropriation laws. All the agencies, the departments, send their appropriation requests directly to initially they're sent to the Treasury, Secretary of Treasury, and the Secretary of Treasury sends them over. But there was nothing to prevent the departments like Department of War, Post Office, things like that, from going directly to Appropriations Committee and asking for money. So they played a game that created something called a coercive deficiency. So the way this worked was a department would get an appropriation that was supposed to last for the fund operations for a year. But then the department, which felt maybe that wasn't enough money really, they would rush to spend all their money in the first 2 months of the year. And then they would send a letter, a request to Congress and say, hey, we've run out of money. You have to appropriate us funds or we're going to cease operations. Now, Congress would then be put in a very awkward situation. They would either have to provide the new funding through a new appropriation law or suffer the consequences of this agency shutting down. And that's why the word is coercive deficiency, where you're saying, hey, I'm out of money and we're coercing the Congress to appropriate new money. And Congress didn't like this, right? As you can imagine, this is not very happy for Congress. So in 1870, they passed the first Anti-Deficiency Act. Now, this isn't the one we have now because the one we have now is a later version, but this is their first attempt to say it's illegal to obligate more money than is appropriated. So, and you can read the text of the law right here. It shall not be lawful for any department of the government to expend in any one fiscal year any sum in excess of appropriations made by Congress for that fiscal year, or to involve the government in any contract for the future payment of money in excess of such appropriations. So it's not just you can't. It's not just spending. They're introducing the concept of obligations back in 1870, and it was done by Senator John Sherman, the brother of the famous General Sherman, who was really trying to get some order. It was just kind of chaotic at this time. Well, that law didn't really work because Congress, the agencies of the government kept playing the coercive deficiency game. And it kind of came into a head in 1879 with the famous post office deficiency. So the post office signed a contract to deliver mail because they contracted out things even back then. And it was a $2 million contract. But they didn't have the money to pay that contract. So they sent a note to the Congress saying, hey, you got to appropriate $2 million or we're going to terminate this contract and the mail will not be delivered. And Postmaster Creswell at the time said the Anti-Deficiency Act doesn't apply, because if I need to not spend the money, I can just terminate the contract. But that meant the mail for large parts of the country would not be delivered. And remember, this is, pre-internet, pre-Amazon. It would essentially shut down a part of the economy and have devastating consequences. So the Congress had paid, appropriated the new money, but they were not happy about this. It was a problem. So finally, in 1905, Congress passed a new Anti-Deficiency Act, because they've been going back and forth. This, it didn't stop in 1879. And what they decided to do is they would require a plan that would lay out the monthly or periodic apportionment to make sure that the appropriation could last the entire year. And they said that adherence to the apportionments had to be followed. But they left a loophole because they said that the head of the department could waiver this. Because remember, there's no Bureau of Budget, there's no OMB at this point in time. And then they said to let Congress know. So this became even more troublesome, and it led to further laws that created the modern legal requirement of an apportionment. And so the legal purpose of an apportionment is to prevent spending at a rate that would create a deficiency. In other words, an apportionment is a plan that says we can do our mission, our statutory responsibilities within the funding that has been appropriated for us. Once an apportionment is approved, the amount apportioned is available for obligation under the terms of the apportionment. Now, see what they're doing here? They're holding the agency kind of hostage, because the agency can't do anything. They can't obligate any money until this plan is approved. And under the modern approach, OMB has to approve the plan. So you have to, in essence, persuade OMB that you have a plan for operating your account for the entire year. So I'm just going to stop there. I think I did at the beginning. There's a question: can you provide the A11 section where the formula that calculates apportionment was calculated? I think it's. Well, I'll just go back here. It was section 123 provides that, and I do not know the name of the 1809 law. I think it was. I'm sorry, I just don't know that. I'll look it up and figure that out later. Okay, so okay. So here's the situation. A contracting officer tells you that he is about to sign a contract for $10 billion to buy a new building. The payments will be $2 billion for 5 years. You look at the apportionment for that account, which states the account has available resources for $3 billion next fiscal year. The apportionment does not indicate any available multi-year budget authority. So it's got $2 billion for the first year. You have somebody's already saying no. Is it okay? And the answer is no, because it has to be a plan for the whole thing. You can't enter into a contract that is for anything, a building, a ship, or an IT system, unless you have the authority, the approved apportionment for the entire period. So good, you got that. Okay. Now let's talk about the apportionment process. Okay. The president has sole authority to prescribe the contents and to approve apportionments. But the president's authority to approve apportionments has been delegated by the director of OMB to the OMB deputy associate directors. So the deputy associate directors at OMB, and if you remember, these are the career officials. OMB is broken out into 5 resource management offices, and these are the career officials in each of the that are head. Now they work for a program associate director, and the program who is a political appointee, and clearly they report to that political appointee. So the political appointees exert significant control over the deputy associate directors, but it's been delegated to them. Executive agencies must submit apportionment requests to OMB by the later of 40 days before the beginning of the fiscal year, or 15 days after the enactment of the appropriation law. Now that first one's kind of not really relevant anymore, because this law was enacted back during a time when the idea was you would have the appropriation law sometime in the summer, so you would know what your funding is going to be when the fiscal year started, and that you would be able to actually plan and think through and send that the results of that plan, the apportionment request to OMB. Well, obviously that is not happening in a while. That we just haven't seen that anymore. But what we have seen is that so that's the latter part is what matters really. It's you have 15 days from the time the appropriation law is passed to submit it to OMB. But you have an incentive to do it as quickly as possible, right? Because you can't obligate funds until the apportionment is approved. And then OMB is given the must approve the apportionment by the later of 20 days before the beginning of the fiscal year, which is kind of mute these days, or 30 days after the enactment of the law. So you have 30 days to get apportionment approved. And this is in code. So this is not something that's subject to, this is the law. This is not OMB Circular A11. This is the actual law. So when are resources apportioned? Unless exempt from apportionment, all multi-year and no-year TAFs with unexpired budget authorities available for obligation must be apportioned every fiscal year. So what does that mean? So let's say you got a 5-year apportionment. Even though it's a 5-year multi-year funding appropriation. Even though it's been 5 years, you still have to do an apportionment every year. So your apportionment is in essence only good for a year. So let's say you're doing it 1/5, 1/5, 1/5, 1/5. That's your plan. So the first year you have to do an apportionment for 1/5. The next year you do the apportionment for the second fifth, and so on. So you can't just do one apportionment and it's good for 5 years. Again, apportionment requests are due to OMB by August 21st for TAFs where budgetary resources is not determined by current action of Congress. And what are we talking about there? Reimbursements. So if you have a reimbursable agreement under some sort of permanent authority, reimbursable program that has multi-year authority, you have to do the apportionment request for the next year by August 21st. That also includes like if you have carryover funding or permanent appropriations or mandatory funding. Or for other apportionments, it's within 10 calendar days. For requests submitted by August 21st, OMB will notify you of the action taken on your request by September 10th or within 30 calendar days after enactment. So how do you submit apportionments? Well, the OMB has a system. There's a web-based system that you send the apportionments to OMB. It's not like the old days where you had to like physically carry the apportionment to OMB, get them to sign the piece of paper, carry it back. It's not like that anymore. But there's an electronic system, and Section 120.31 will tell you about that system, and it's accessed via your Max account. So what are the basic rules for apportionments? Each new apportionment in a fiscal year supersedes the previous apportionments taken earlier that year. So as things change when you go through the fiscal year, if for example, you have a reimbursable agreement, you got more money than you expected, or you changed your plan and you're going to shift around how you spend the money, you can submit a new apportionment during the course of the year. But once you submitted that new apportionment, the old apportionment is superseded. Apportionments are never subject to change after the period for which the apportionment is made. For example, fiscal year or a quarter. So you can't like cheat, like if because you can see why this is true. Because if you could change the apportionment after the fiscal year, you'd never be anti-deficient because you just go back and change things and move it around. So once it's done, the period is done. The apportionment is what it is. New apportionment action for a fiscal year is independent of all apportionment actions for the previous year. In other words, you got to start over again. At the beginning of the fiscal year, you need to apportion all your accounts. You can't say, "Oh, this is a no year account and we apportioned it last year. It's good for this year." No, no, no. You got to start over and do all your counts. Any deficiency act is binding to the last approved apportionment before the account expiration, right? Because if the now, what do we mean by account expiration? So this goes into the life cycle of funds, where after a fund has ended its period of availability for obligations. So if it's a 1 year fund on September 30th of that year, it's it's no longer available for obligation. But the funds can still be obligated, funds can still be outlaid, they can still be expended. But that is only lasts for 5 years. And um, so the last approved apportionment is what governs those outlays for the period after the period of availability has ended. Okay, so question. An analyst comes to you and indicates that there should be some changes to last year's apportionment. Is it okay to make the changes? No, because at the end of the year, it's pencils down in essence, and that's done. Okay, great, you got that. So now let's get into how is an apportionment organized. So it will not surprise you that there is an OMB Circular A11 section 1210 in this case that tells you how to do this. And it lays out the format for the form because it is an SF 132 apportionment and reapportionment. A reapportionment is when during the year you want to change your apportionment. So the first part of the top of the apportionment shows the name of the account, right? The account number, and it can have some additional information about like the bureau name, the account name, and stuff like that. So this is basically the header information up here, if you can see that. Then there's a section on budgetary resources, and we're going to go through these sections in a little more detail. So I'm just giving you the highlights here, but it's always at the top of toward the top of the apportionment, and it basically shows all the budgetary resources that are available for that account. And then there's the application of budgetary resources. And that essentially shows how the resources are going to be spent, either by time period or by project, program, and activities. And we will not talk about this, but guaranteed loans for credit reform programs have their own section that's followed down. Okay. So let's again just take a look at examples. See this? Here's the TAFs, the name at the top, right? You will only use the lines that your agency needs. So a lot of times, if there's rows that don't apply to you, you don't use them. So let's talk about the budgetary resources section and why do we have a budgetary resources section? First, the budgetary resource section provides the detail for OMB to see what level is funding is coming into the TAFs. Because remember, it's not so simple that the budget authority and the appropriation law is the budgetary resources, the resources available. There's all kinds of other types of funds that come into an account. There's unobligated balances from the previous year, the carryover. There can be transfers into the account. There can be other types of things that come on, recoveries and all kinds of things. And Section 82 of OMB Circular A11 lists all these different things and what they come in. So the purpose of the budgetary resource section is to show you all the sources of resources for this particular account. The resource lines on apportionments match the lines used in the President's budget programming financing schedule and the SF-33. So remember we talked about there's a life cycle. There's the President's budget appendix, and that has a budgetary resources table, right? And that table says where all the resources coming from. So that needs to tie to what's in the apportionment, which is what actually happened with the law when it was passed and all the other resources coming into it. And then that needs to tie to the SF-133, which is the report on budget execution. So you need to be able to have a crosswalk and alignment, a line of sight through all those three documents. And that's what the budgetary resources section provides. And so they use the same line numbers, and we'll talk about. And then this is the first step in the agency's budget execution process. So Appendix F of OMB of A11 specifies the line numbers, and it lists the line numbers, and it's several pages, about 10 or 15 pages, I think, and then it lists the number, and then it says, okay, here's the definition. And so I just wanted to put down here some of the common ones. And as you go into the budget profession, it's a good idea to just kind of learn these numbers, because most experienced budget analysts know that 1,000 is unobligated balances brought forward on October 1st. And 1,100 means appropriation. That means it's in the appropriation amount. That's the amount in the appropriation law for discretionary funds. 1,200 is appropriation mandatory. Now, is that amount listed in the law? Is there a law like for Social Security that says $1,341 billion will be available? Why? The answer, someone got it, no. Why is it no? Because mandatory funds, the amount of money spent determines how many people is determined by how many people meet the conditions in the law. So there's a law that says if you are disabled through military service, and if you're at 80% disability rating, you get this amount of money. The government doesn't know how many people are going to every year is going to get that rating, so they specify the conditions, not the amount. But what they do as part of the budget process is they make estimates, right? Every year you make an estimate of what you're going to spend, and that is what is in line 1,200, the estimate, not what's in a law, but the estimate of what the law will bill. Because Social Security kind of knows or makes an estimate of how many people are going to turn 65 who are eligible for the benefits. And pensions, they know how many people are going to retire. They can guess it, and they can make an estimate. So that's what 1,200 is all about. 1,700 is spending authority from offsetting collections. And offsetting collections are things like, fees collected at the park is the classic example of that. And again, they don't know exactly how many people are going to show up at the park every year, so they make an estimate of the collections. And then you have to reconcile and make sure you don't spend more money than you actually get in collections. And there's a whole process for that. And 1,800 is spending authority from mandatory reimbursables. So that's the budgetary resource section. The next section that tells you how much resources you have, basically how much money you can obligate. Now the question is, and remember, this is to avoid coercive deficiency. The question is, how are you going to spend that money? And you're going to spend it according to a plan to make sure you don't run out of money. So to do this, OMB usually uses 4 categories to apportion resources. So category A is apportionments of budgetary resources by time period, usually quarters is what OMB does. And that's for things like S&E accounts, because you can kind of plan like, okay, we have 5,000 employees and we know what their pay is going to be each quarter, and we kind of know things like that. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there a question? Oh, I'm sorry. I do not know what the 1809 law is. I'm sorry. So that's what category A is, where it works for a program that can be kind of planned out over time periods. But there's some things where you really need to plan it by project and activity. Maybe it's a major acquisition. So you don't know exactly what quarter the ship is going to be finished. So you don't know exactly when the contract is going to be released. So that therefore they have a different method for the application of budgetary resources. It's by program, project, or activity. And that's called category B. And now for some accounts, there's a mixture because you might have some S&E, salary and expense, but you might have some big projects. So there's something called AB, and that's category AB. And then the last one is category C, and that's for multi-year funds where let's say you've got $1 billion and you're going to spend it over 5 years. It's a 5-year appropriation of $1 billion. You're going to do $200 billion a year. I'm sorry, $200 million a year for 5 years. So what you would do is put in category C for the first year, $800 million. And that basically means that's funding that's going to be spent in future years. Okay. And you can do a combination. So here's an example of reporting categories for category B, training and employment, workforce safety, apprenticeships, things like that. Note that agencies are required to report in GTAS. Now, GTAS is the budgetary reporting system, these categories. But the Anti-Deficiency Act does not apply to categories. It's just an accounting thing. Now, apportionments include other types of information. And again, there's a whole nother world for loan programs that we're not going to talk about. Guaranteed loan levels and application sections. So there are also footnotes that provide additional detail associated with one of the lines in the request. So if there needs some explanatory information. Program recording categories that identify the level of detail that an agency must report on SF-133, things like that. And then different reports and stuff like that. So there is additional information. And this is worked out kind of account by account with OMB. So when do you request changes to previously approved apportionment, right? So you do your apportionment at the beginning of the year, you begin to obligate funds, but then you realize that something's changed and that the approved apportionment isn't going to work. So you can submit what they call a reapportionment request to OMB when these things happen. Your budget, and again, I'm just reading from the A11 because I don't want to mess it up. Your budgetary resources have increased since your previous apportionment for the fiscal year. So example, if you have an offsetting collection and more people are showing up at the park than you anticipated, that's you do a reapportionment because you may need to spend that additional money. Maybe you have to hire additional staff to handle the crowd or do more cleaning or something like that. Also, there could be a supplemental has passed or something like that. So these are the reasons you want to do a reapportionment. And there may be programmatic changes. Maybe there was a need to shift the grant program earlier in the cycle because to deal with an emergency, you got to get the grants out faster. So you change your plan, things like that. But you got to have a reason for doing it. LB you can't just do it because, I forgot something or something like that. You need to really think this through and have a plan because that's the intent of the law. Continuing, when you do a reapportionment, it must allow time for action by OMB. So you need to submit your request for reapportionment in time, so that OMB has time to evaluate your request. You can't say, hey, we got to obligate this contract for a huge amount of money tomorrow, so this afternoon you got to get it done. OMB does not play that way. There have been some exceptions to that. 9/11 people who were in OMB will tell you stories about how they did some massive reapportionments to fund the response to 9/11. And then this last clause, when emergencies such as those involving the safety of human life or the protection of property require immediate action, you can request and OMB may approve a reapportionment by email. So there is kind of like an emergency provision, and then you have to do the formal process as soon as possible thereafter. But again, this is only for extraordinary things. It can't be like, we forgot. So question, line 1920, which is the total of resources available on an apportionment, has a value of $100 million. A budget analyst brings you a report that total obligations for the year for that account will be $120 million. Is this a good situation? No, it's an ADA. This is classic ADA. Okay. Pause a breath here. I know it's late. Okay. Ready to go. We're going to try and okay. So requirements, we're moving into how the relationship between apportionments and budget execution. So under the Anti-Deficiency Act, under code, the head of agencies are required to allocate funds in writing among the major organizational units. So the apportionment is at the account level, it's at a high level. And some of these apportionments, can be for literally billions of dollars. And the law recognizes that that may not be adequate for true financial control, that if you only control things at the high level, you really aren't going to, you might be surprised. You might end up in a coercive deficiency situation. So the head of the agency is required to allocate the funds and, divided up the funds among the major subordinate organizations in the agency. And allocations among the major units are called allotments. And then when the major unit further subdivides it's called a sub-allotment. And these allotments are approved by the head of an executive agency and can only be changed by a written document. So there has to be a written system. You have to write all this down. And then today that written system is usually the funds controls in your accounting system. But violations of allotments and sub-allotments. So if you're running an organization and you got an allotment that says you got $100 million and you obligate $110 million, that's a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Now, for the agency as a whole, you might be okay because some other organization may be underspending by $10 million. But that doesn't matter. Each subordinate organization head is responsible for living within or spending within their allotted funds. Okay. So I kind of covered this. The head of the agency is responsible for establishing a system that restricts expenditures to the amounts of the apportionment. And I put a code over here to show you that this is law. This is not guidance. It's not, something you do if you want to do. This is not, it's not just good management, though it is good management. This is law, and that's why I put this code over here. And that the head of agency must enable the ability to fix responsibility for an obligation or expenditure that exceeds an apportionment. See, if it's at the high level and you exceed and the agency exceeds its apportionment, you don't really know. You don't really know who it was, right? Because it's one big bucket of funds, and you don't know which $10 million were the offenders for ADAs. And I like the comment, it's time for DOBs, is a response to the question before. Yeah, you better rapidly do some quick deobligations. So that's why they want you to do the allotment and the sub-allotment, to make sure that you can fix responsibility at a low enough level that you know who's caused the Anti-Deficiency Act violation. And so there is guidance on how to do this. There's Section 150 and Appendix H of OMB Circular A11. And so this just is a chart that shows how it works. And you can see at the top level, the apportionment covers the top of the account, kind of the roll-up of the whole account. The apportionment does. But then within the agency, under Section 150, you have a series of allotments and then sub-allotments that fix responsibility. So if this person down in allotment division 3A exceeds their budget, their allotment, then they're the ones that is responsible, because when it rolls up, it can cause the whole account to be out of anti-deficiency. So you try to catch it down here before it rolls up. Any questions about that? So one thing that was really important, though, to reconcile your apportionments to internal budget execution reporting. So most agencies do an operating plan that's more detailed than the apportionment, right? They may do monthly instead of quarterly, and they'll do it at lower organizational levels. But what you want to make sure you do is that these things roll up and tie to the apportionment. Because if you don't do that, you could mess up and you could be giving false information to your leaders because you go in and brief them that according to your operating plan, everything's good. But if it doesn't tie to the apportionment, you don't really know that. So when you're generating internal budget execution reports, make sure that they roll up to the apportionment. Okay? And then ultimately, this needs to tie to the SF-133 at the end of the year. You need to make sure that all your reports for your subordinate organizations tie to the budget execution reports, the SF-133 at the account level at the end of the year. So let's do continuing resolutions and apportionments. Talk about that. So we covered this a little bit, but we're just going to review what is a continuing resolutions. They're joint resolutions that provide continuing appropriations for a part of the fiscal year or a full fiscal year. So a CR is a law passed by Congress that provide temporary funding or partial year funding. Now, we're going to do, quote, full year, at least that's what the news is reporting, in a couple weeks for the rest of this fiscal year, because it's, we're almost 6 months into the year. CR is often enacted when Congress has not yet passed a new appropriations bill by October 1st. And we're living that now. We don't have appropriation bills. Or when the president has vetoed an appropriation bill. That has not happened this time. It's just that Congress has not passed the bill. Because of the nature of short-term CR, each agencies are required to operate at minimal level until the regular fiscal year appropriations are enacted. The reason for this is that the CR needs to preserve the flexibility of Congress to pass funding at the level they deem is appropriate. So you don't want to have a kind of coercive deficiency situations because you spent so much money in the early part of a CR and now the appropriation you get isn't enough. So that's why Congress does that. CRs don't, as we talked about before, do not provide specific dollars. They calculate a formula, the CR rate, and it's basically the number of days for the CR divided by 365, and that's the percentage of your previous year funding that is available. So that is called the rate of operations, which is defined as the annualized level of resources that are available only through the period of time covered by the short-term CR. These two terms, rate of operations and annualized level, are pretty used simultaneously. The rate for operations is calculated for a TAF. So the Treasury account, the account is what you calculate the spending for. So it's set up by the period availability and worked into multi-year funding. The following steps are used to calculate, and it's just a pretty simple math formula, right? You take the full year amount enacted in the Appropriation Act specified in Section 101, which is the first section of a CR. So they'll tell you, this is the law that is set the base amount, if you will. Then you subtract any recurring account specific rescissions and any bill-wide reductions, and so it's what was in the bill referred to in Section 101. You reduce it by any rescissions, and then you add or subtract transfers mandated by the Appropriation Act, and that gives you the kind of the base rate, and then you multiply that by the number of days, the fraction that you get by dividing number of days by 365, unless it's a leap year. And so this is an example, and we can just, and I'm going to let you read this on your own. The slides are available, but it just walks you through how this works, where you figure out your base rate, you subtract 50 million, you track this transfer, and then you calculate the factor, the number. So what happens after a CR That's when we use automatic apportionments that under section 12041 that we talked about earlier, where there's a bulletin that goes out and says this is the percentage of funding that is available. And that's how it works with post-CR apportionment. So are there any questions? So I went a little fast. I hope but I hope I conveyed the essence of what we're trying to talk about. I know it's been a long day, and we didn't have a break. But if there any question, there's a question, Tara. You want to just unmute and ask it?
Yes, hold on.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, good. I apologize. Okay, my question is not very much related to apportionments, so I can hold off. But it is something I think you could answer, and it's something I've been wondering for a long time.
Well, go ahead and ask it. We have
Okay.
time.
Okay. In building, say this is theoretical scenario, when you're building your civ pay budget, and you include awards, this is in accordance with A11, I think section 32.
Mhm.
They provide guidance on award amounts. And so that's rolled up into your agency budget. In this case, it would be like a 1-year direct salary and expenses account that pays for payroll. Now, what do you do if the awards change, the cycle changes, for instance, and all awards are paid out in the next fiscal year? Can you accrue at the end of the fiscal year for those awards?
Only if you have carryover authority, right? So budget authority, if it's 1 year authority, then that expires, right? And if you haven't given the award, you haven't made an obligation. Now, if you made the award, like let's say you do it at the last few days of the fiscal year, you enter the award into this system and you make the award, that's creating an obligation. And I believe you can do that before, and then the payment could come later. But if you have not given the award out, you have not made an obligation, and so those funds would expire. And so you can't do that, is my understanding.
Okay. So, and here's another question, when OMB audits, award information, I always thought that, but when they audit, you would run it through your financial, just run the financial records, and that's the answer. And those would be tying the fiscal year to the budget, to the guidance in the A11. But are we saying that what you would want to do is budget to pay for the current fiscal year's awards in the next fiscal year?
No, you can't. Well, if it's when you make the award, and there's some complexity here, you may want to talk to an appropriations attorney or talk to your OMB examiner. But my general understanding is, like, like a lot of people make awards for the previous year after the fiscal year, and they may. There's some nuance about this, so I'm gonna kind of direct you to go talk to your agency experts at appropriation law, because I'm not sure exactly that you can make an obligation for award for the previous year. That's the question. Maybe I'm just drawing a
Yeah.
blank here.
So, and also,
So
that it is a period of performance, that is even the name, it is the period of performance for the prior,
so I would
not
go ask your appropriation
okay.
lawyer. I'm like, we're not supposed to opine on policy, because that's, I don't work for OMB. I'm not, I don't give guidance. I try to explain things as best I can, but I'm not an authoritative source of guidance. So I try, but okay. Any other questions? All right. thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to Janice.
Are you ending, Andy? Okay. Thank you, Andy, for your presentation. Thank you to all the presenters for the past 2 days. Thank you to everyone that have joined us for the 2-day intro to budget forum. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please remember to fill out the post survey form that's going to be emailed to you. Thanks again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, your evening, and the rest of your week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Andy. Bye.
See you next time. Bye-bye.